Hello, my
Hello.
name is Virginia Atkinson. I'm the Senior Global Inclusion Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And I'm here today with Rylin Rodgers, who is the Disability Policy Director at Microsoft. And we will be having a conversation on disability inclusive technology and how that can be used in elections. So more and more technology is being used in elections as part of the registration process, as part of voting itself, the counting process. And as I think we all know, also more and more social media and websites are being used as part of the voter education process. So thank you, Rylin, for joining us in this global year of elections for this important conversation about Microsoft's work on accessible election technology.
Great to be here. I'm excited.
So you're currently the Disability Policy Director at Microsoft, but before you joined Microsoft, you worked in the nonprofit space. So could you share a little bit about how you began working on accessibility?
Yeah, I always say that I was born to work on disability policy. I'm a disabled woman. I was born in the United States in 1975, and that's the year that we first had the right to a free and appropriate public education for disabled students. So I was amongst the first generation of students who benefited from a policy change that gave me access to the education that built the foundation of my life. And obviously, I didn't know that in kindergarten. But I knew that shortly after, that it mattered a lot how public policy works for disabled people where they are in the world. And I became really interested in it, and then decided to make it my life's work as an adult when I expanded my family and became the parent of two now young adults who live with complicated medical and physical disabilities. And that led me to get really interested in how healthcare worked or didn't work in the United States and how our voices came together. So I had a long and windy path doing lots of grassroots, grassroots, university, and not-for-profit work, ultimately leading me to move to Washington, D.C. to work full-time on disability policy for a national organization. That was the first time I got to do election work and disability work at the national level, although I'd done it at the state level before. And so, that career led me when Microsoft had a disability policy advisor role. My sort of interest was, what does that mean from a corporate point of view? And so let me take my experience, my lived experience with disability, my disability policy experience, and bring it together with a corporation to do advocacy. So it's been nice to have a history in disability policy. It's sort of who I am. It's my hobby. It's my work. There's no boundaries in that area. But similar in the voting space, it's, who I am as a citizen in a democracy. It was advocacy work I did at the state level, then at the U.S. federal level, and then now to be working with a multinational company to be able to have the conversation internationally has been exciting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I also came to disability from a combination of my own personal lived experience and that of family members as well. So it seems both of us brought together for the same reasons here. But you're now focusing specifically on technology. So I wonder how for other people that are maybe interested in entering this field, how would you define for them, digital accessibility and digital inclusion?
Yeah, I often think about it in a couple of ways. At Microsoft, we see accessibility as a fundamental right. And I think that resonates with the disability community because we're familiar in the US with the Americans with Disabilities Act and that civil rights frame. We're familiar internationally with the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which also gives a civil and human rights frame.
Mhm.
And the history of both of those efforts were really about how do we ensure that every person has the opportunity with equity to participate in community and education and work to be who we are. And so societies can benefit from all of us. And in the sort of time between those foundational civil rights, human rights frames to where we are today, the reality is that to be included and to have access in society, you need to have both physical access and digital access. It isn't one or the other. You have to have both points of access. And so that's been a helpful place to come into the conversation. And certainly incredibly important right now as we're seeing a new wave of technology in the frame of AI accelerate in some ways really exciting things around accessibility and create some accelerated challenges. So those pieces have to fit together in terms of where does technology move forward. And I know that in the disability community, many of us are aware of how it's falling short, how we may be familiar with websites or apps that haven't been fully accessible. We may be familiar that things are still not designed with accessibility in mind. But we've also seen tremendous growth, and I get excited about those shifts and how do we figure out how to continue the journey moving forward. And I like that word journey because accessibility in the physical space is not something you do once and then it's fine. It's a continued commitment to making sure everyone has a place and are able to get to the place. And the same is true in the digital space. This is not something we're going to be done with. This has to be a continuous process of how we operate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you've talked a lot about why it's important for Microsoft as well as other technology companies to prioritize accessibility. Microsoft is a leader in this space. Do you have any lessons learned or experience that you could share with others that are trying to do the same thing and institutionalize disability inclusion across their company or their organization?
Yeah, it's absolutely a continuous learning process. So we are by no means perfect, but there's a couple of key things that have been major points of strength. One is empowering our disabled workforce and expanding our disabled workforce. So at Microsoft, we hire for talent and we see the talent of lived experience and perspective around disability as key to making sure that we're innovating. So over 8% of our workforce publicly identifies as disabled, and that's growing. And that's likely an underrepresentation of who amongst us lives with disability, but it is the talent of disabled people in all types of jobs at Microsoft that help us innovate, that help us move forward. So having that key workforce, making sure that that workforce is empowered. The team I work with in Microsoft came out of the ERGs, the employee resource groups, and then became a more structured team. So really making it a part of how we work. So that's a key piece. Another key piece is that it can't just be the internal folks. We think about what we learn constantly from partners in the community and from customers in the community around needs and product solves and design in the accessibility space, around communication, about there may be great things that are built into our products that are driving accessibility, but community members aren't aware of it. And how do we move it to make it more discoverable so that people know how to use their products in a digitally accessible way? So that partnership with the community and making sure that they're driving things forward has been a critical part of the success. And then I think that commitment to it not being either both a siloed effort, it's not something that's part of the accessibility team alone. Every person at Microsoft who works here has to take accessibility training. It's part of all of our jobs, whether we work on accessibility or not. That sort of culture commitment, I think, is really important. And the idea that, it's not going to be a checking a box or about compliance. It's about that striving for helping every person and every organization on the planet. And so you have to make it a delightful experience. You could make a website accessible and meet basic regulations and guidelines, and it could still be really unpleasant to use. And that's not helpful. Like, we need it to be above and beyond whatever the basic regulations are to be usable and a really delightful experience. So as a disabled person, whether I'm using the digital tool to make my vacation plans or to get my graduate degree or as part of my job, that it's a good experience in what I'm doing. So those sort of not relying on sort of a bar, but trying to move past it, making sure that we're working in partnership with the community and having those experts as part of our teams have been three key parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, 8%, congratulations. That's fantastic. I know a lot of companies have been writing, 1 or 2% goals and are not meeting those.
Yeah,
So.
I love one of the things that drove me here is that it's at 8%, it's growing, but that's not the goal. The goal is that it represents the rate of disability in the world. So we've got a lot of room to get there. And
Mhm.
I think that speaks to how do we get the best products, the best service, and the best company.
Yeah. You also talked a little bit about awareness and making sure that people with disabilities are even aware that there are these resources that are built into the technology that can help with accessibility. And one big mechanism around awareness raising, as you know, is the Global Disability Summit, which happens about every 3 years. And in 2022, Microsoft made a commitment specifically around accessible election technology. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us sort of why did Microsoft decide to prioritize that, and is it something you're thinking might continue at the next summit in 2025 next year?
Yeah, so I love that when I arrived at Microsoft, one of the first people that I met was a parallel team to where I work, their Democracy Forward team, and they were engaged in elections. And I said, "Excellent, let me tell you all about my hopes and dreams for fully accessible elections globally and the right of every person to cast an independent private ballot." They're like, "Wow, you've got a list." I said, "Yeah, I've got a list." But they were working on some technology to really try to provide additional tools so that people to respond to concerns about security in digital ballot casting. So they were working on something called Election Guard, which exists. It's actually Microsoft has given it to not-for-profits. We are no longer own it. We freely donated it to the greater world so it can continue to move. But it allows for a way to ensure that there was end-to-end encryption in a digital sense on voting so that you could have security and accessibility at the same time, which often comes up as a discussion about do we have to have a paper ballot so that it's secure? And this was another tool to add a dimension in that. But it gave us a jumping off point to say this is some place that we're working. There's a role for technology. Microsoft doesn't create voting machines as ourselves, but some of our customers do.
Mhm.
And so what's our role in the space? And so that's what brought us there. Fast forward to where we are right now, I would say if anything, we're more involved in elections around accessibility. This cycle, there's been a huge amount of work around the information side that you referenced earlier. As people have shifted to getting information digitally, can we help fill some of the gaps to make sure that information, both from campaigns, from election officials, et cetera, is available accessibly? And so that's been an area where we've been doing a lot of work. I'm really proud. In the United States, we've worked with partners for the Center for Democracy and Technology, no, the Center for Civic Design and the American Association for People with Disabilities on something called accessiblevoting.net, which takes all the information about what your voting rights are in every state in America, because every state's a little different, around accessibility, and puts it on a fully accessible website. So those have been some of the places that we've been. So the short answer is we're very involved. We're not going to stop being involved. This is a priority across the company. Elections, participation in democracy, accessibility in that space. Not sure what that will look like in terms of a pledge, but pledge or no pledge, it's a continuous part of our priorities and our investments.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, you talked a little bit about this, but Microsoft, played a role in the EU elections this past summer in making those more accessible, and you're continuing your work ahead of the US presidential elections this fall. Can you tell us a little bit more about some upcoming work that you're doing to further improve accessible election technology?
Yeah, I think this has been a great example of how critical our partners have been in working closely with the disability community. So we have amazing partners in Europe, the European Disability Forum, and every year we host together an event on accessible technology. And this year, one of the topics was accessible election access in Europe ahead of the EU elections. Our event was in May, their elections were in June. And it was great to have a convening where there was information sharing about digital ballot return and what was happening in different member states. And so that was a place where we were able to share our values our goals, and really some of our customers spoke about tools that they have that are available and how we want to continue that moving forward. Similar things are happening in the United States. I mentioned the accessible voting.net website. We've also are sharing quite a lot of information around voting and access to voting, accessible voting through our own channels. So Microsoft has a search engine called Bing. That search engine has been getting increased traffic in the last 18 months to 2 years because it now includes an opportunity for people to use AI as part of the search. You don't have to do it that way, but it's a tool that's available there. So it's driven up our traffic quite a lot, but we're sharing voting information through that search engine as we come up to the elections. There's also lots of ways where our team on the Democracy Forward Time side is engaged, supporting campaigns in their journey around accessibility, supporting access to information. So sort of the layers of what's happening are they're layered and complicated, but it's really about opportunities. I think the other place that I'm particularly excited about and proud of is that we've joined the disability community to try to elevate some of the issues and concerns. And one of the issues and concerns is sometimes there's barriers to getting good information about candidates and candidate choices. In the US, when we have our presidential debates, there's not on-screen sign language. And so we've joined with the disability community in sending a letter talking about how the access to information in the debate format could be improved, and sent it first to CNN, and then the next debate will be, I believe, on ABC and there. And it's a chance to talk about what we're seeing globally. We talked about the year of elections, and in the UK, when you saw the prime minister's debate on screen for everybody's audience, no matter where you were watching the broadcast, you could see British Sign Language. And that's not something that Americans have access to at this point. So thinking through how can we take those lessons of access to information and help spread them has been a part of our work this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you kind of segued into the next thing I wanted to ask you about very nicely, which is around, election management bodies. So the government ministries that usually run the elections in countries around the world. For many of them, integrating voting technology often competes with limited resourcing and also security concerns. What advice do you have for election management bodies if they're considering procuring technology, and what should they be prioritizing?
I love that you said the word procuring, because I think there's a shift, and we spent some time working on the education around it, but there's continued work to do on the education around it. There's a bit of misunderstanding often around procurement that if you are going to buy a system and you want it to be accessible, that will come at an extraordinarily high cost. And it misunderstands how technology works and what's currently built in. And it's sort of a relic of what we might have experienced in the past. It was very common even 15, 20 years ago that to interact with in the digital space with any computer or any system, you needed to also use aftermarket assistive technology. So whether that's a program or a piece of hardware, that was a common piece of the conversation. But what's happened in the last couple decades is that many accessibility features are now being built in. So this is true for Microsoft, it's true for Google, it's true for Apple, but things like screen readers or captions, magnifiers, other pieces are now available off the shelf. And so when people are procuring, they can be asking for the software, the materials to to deliver training, come to them as an accessible product so that it can be delivered accessibly. And it's often at this point about basically turning on what you've already paid for and making sure those features are being used. And I think that's a really important shift. One of the ways that we've tried to help make it in the US, and it's kind of a test to see if it helps, is we've taken guidance that's meant for election officials around accessibility and put it on our public-facing accessiblevoting.net to see if it spurs the advocacy community to use it in conversations with elected officials, because it will shift the narrative. It empowers people to say, hey, this doesn't have to be this way. Your poster on the wall doesn't have to be the only way you're conveying information. You could be conveying and offering an option for me to have audio access to that poster. Or if you're having election training for poll workers, you could absolutely have on-screen captions for everything that's being said in that meeting for somebody who's hard of hearing, has a language disability, or is deaf, to have exact real-time information. And you can do that on or offline with technology now. It's not an additional cost. So really getting people to make that shift and to know what's available on both the citizen side and on the government side. I'm excited to see that tension and where we'll get.
Yeah. You've talked about some advice for citizens and for governments in terms of accessibility. Do you have advice for the election community on how we should be thinking about technology accessibility standards? So you've talked about like some guidance for approaches, but do you have any guidance on standards, both in terms of as we're looking at procurement or building new technologies or using existing resources that are already there, or maybe partnering on this type of technology? What do they need to know, the elections community?
Yeah, so I probably unpopular opinion, but I don't think standards are the only or even sometimes the best way to think about it. Because historically, we've done a pretty good job on having standards that thinks about the digital accessibility experience of people with sensory disabilities, so blind or hard of hearing. We haven't always included the needs in terms of digital accessibility of people with intellectual or learning disabilities in those standards. So when my advice when thinking about how do we deliver digital accessibility in the election space is to think very broadly across the disability spectrum and to do the work to ensure that you're enabling all access features to meet all dimensions of accessibility. And that takes some thinking that's best done in partnership with the disability community. But it is more readily, easily possible and affordable now than it has ever been. And I think that's a really exciting thing to think about. Because if we only thought about standards, we might do a great job of making something run per screen reader, but we might miss the opportunity to use the power of AI to turn complicated text into plain language, easy read that can create equitable access for somebody with an intellectual disability. And those dimensions of the disability experience are so crucial. And now we have a real opportunity to use digital tools to create new equity in that space. So I think that's really important. I don't want to totally go off script because absolutely we should meet minimum standards. And there are regulations in place and they are growing. I'm sort of excited in the United States, there are now finally regulations about websites and apps for states. I think that's going to matter a lot to election officials in the coming years as they reach that bar. I'm hopeful that the Justice Department will extend the website and app guidance broadly outside of just state and local government, but it's a place to start that will have significant impact, and meeting those standards is absolutely critical, but it's not the end goal. It should be about what's available, what's possible, and how do we use those tools to meet the needs of our citizens and our voters.
Yeah, thank you, Rylin. You mentioned AI, and Microsoft has principle. Microsoft's AI principles provide sort of a blueprint for operationalizing inclusive and responsible AI. Have you seen some promising applications, or are there any examples you can share with us that are related to elections or supporting voters or candidates with disabilities?
So a couple of things that I've seen people use, which is interesting because I'm not seeing them systematically yet, which is not terribly surprising. A little bit systematically, like you're seeing people use auto captions to make campaign videos more accessible and those kinds of sort of lower hanging fruit. But what I am starting to see is disabled people who are often the first adopters of new technology and innovators using it. And I mentioned sort of the poster on the wall. So it's in my polling place, you walk in and there's lots of posters with directions about what to expect, which ID you need, which I don't need ID in my state. My last state I did because America's confusing.
Yep.
But there's posters with lots of directions. And when I was most recently in that setting, I saw a person who pulled out their individual phone and used AI to turn that into an audio description of everything on the poster and all of the content. So there was no longer a barrier around access. They were using AI to unblock the inaccessible information. And I've heard about that in terms of ballot access and where there might not be clarity or people feeling comfortable of what they're getting from the election device. Can I check it with my own? And I think that's interesting to think about and to see in action. I'm also seeing candidates think about what am I missing in terms of ways to use AI to create greater access and campaigns to think about it. So we're learning a lot. I think we're all going to learn a lot. And what comes next will probably be the more systematic use of it. But it is helpful to me now to see, in the last election cycles, we might have seen far fewer videos that had captions available to them. And now we're seeing many, many campaign or government videos around voting information that have captions built in, that they're using auto captioning. And then those of us who might need the captioning and it's not showing up are adding our own tools on top to unblock those videos. And so those kinds of ways that AI is changing the information access is promising.
So you mentioned the future. My last question for you is, what do you envision as the future for accessible election technology, say maybe in the next 5 to 10 years?
This is an interesting question because I think about everything from a policy lens. So if I was going to talk just about what's possible in terms of technology, there is now technology available that could create voting options so that the vast majority, overwhelming majority of people would be able to cast a private independent vote using technology to address how their disability impacts their voting system. The reality is to get there, to get people to be able to do that will also take policy change. And there has been a bit of a jam in the policy conversation related to how do we use that power of accessibility and that innovation and balance it against worries about security. And security in elections matters a lot. So I think that conversation is going to be critical in the next several years. And it's one of the things I appreciate about the work you do and about my opportunity to think beyond just one country, because we're starting to see examples of where it's happening and happening safely and happening well. And so when we can have more of those data points, we can share them globally and get to a place where people are able to use technology to vote in the way that works best for them. But it is absolutely not just a technology conversation. It's going to have to be a policy conversation as well.
I said that was my last question, but now I have one more. Do you have recommendations for organizations like IFES and our partners, which are both election civil society organizations as well as organizations of people with disabilities? How can we help Microsoft and other advocates like yourself unstick these policy challenges and take advantage of these new opportunities that technology is providing?
Yeah, so a couple of things. We both have talked about it's been the year of elections, so we have lots of new experiences. So I know you're in the process of writing up things. Everybody and their brother is going to write up things, but we make sure that we take the lessons learned and we push them forward is going to be critical. I'm also somewhat pragmatic in my efforts to try to change the world in terms of policy. And I often look for, is there an opportunity? So in many countries, either following election or in the run-up to a new election, there is a policy conversation around voting in general. In the United States, it will likely be the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. other countries will have other mechanisms. And I think we all have a responsibility to make sure that wherever those conversations are happening, that the needs of disabled voters are part of the conversation. Because too often it's been a separate silo that comes later, but there is this sort of anticipatory cycle of what happens following elections and preparing for elections about public policy conversations around voting. And when those conversations are happening, that's the right moment to push and increase access to good policy that increases accessible voting opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to working with you and with other allies and advocates in this space on, pushing forward these opportunities that definitely technology is presenting, as well as helping to kind of move forward so that we do have this future in the next 5 to 10 years that really is leveraging all of the potential that technology provides for accessibility.
Awesome. It was great to talk to you.
You too. Thank you, Rylin.
Thanks.
Bye.